Hello, listeners. Thank you for tuning in. And just a heads up, in today's episode, we discuss some rather heavy and potentially triggering subjects related to mental illness and abuse. So we thought we'd just give you the heads up now. There are resources in the show notes. Thank you.
How good is Australia?
There's fucking language.
Let there be 1,000 blossoms bloom as far as I'm concerned. You know, but I ain't spending any time on it.
Give him a Valium. Don't stop wearing the Speedos.
You're listening to Decode, the Betoota Advocate's podcast series for those Australians who have tuned out or never tuned in to the dark arts of federal politics.
It's called being, you wouldn't believe it, a goddamn bloody adult.
Well, in a couple of days' time, Australians will head to the polls to decide their future. And today's episode of the Betoota Advocate's Decode podcast will be the last interview we publish before that date. My name is Clancy Overall, editor of the Betoota Advocate, and I'm joined by Errol Parker, editor-at-large. How are you, Errol? Are you sick of this shit yet?
No, Clancy, I think that's a wrong attitude to have in these dying days of the election campaign, because this is when the politically uninvested start to open their ears and eyes to the messaging that each party is putting forward. The televised debates are over and now it's time for just some raw old-fashioned campaigning, something that both leaders need to keep in mind.
That is true, and either way, this hideous news cycle will come to an end one way or another this weekend, providing it isn't a hung parliament, because if that's the case, we might not ever hear the end of this shit.
But a hung parliament, though, is not the worst outcome. I mean, Bob Katter got his first dam, and in the interests of democracy, I'd say it's probably the best outcome.
Well, that certainly is the sentiment shared by many people in Western Queensland. Now, back to today's episode. Throughout this federal election podcast series, we've tried to remain as balanced and impartial as possible. We've interviewed both sides of the political spectrum, from David Littleproud, the Ag Minister, to Murray Watt, the Shadow Minister for Emergencies. We've interviewed independents like Allegra Spender, David Pocock, Rebecca Sharkey. We've even interviewed the Torres Strait Islander incarnation of Bob Katter in the shape of Rod Jensen, the KAP candidate for Leichhardt up there in the tip.
Yes, we've certainly cast a wide net. That's to avoid accusations of taking funding from any political organisations or billionaires with vested interests, which we've never done, and we never will, and we'll leave that to the good people at Sky News. But if you're listening, Walshy, wouldn't mind a little cash injection or a piece of timeless art?
Yeah, home's a court. You know, those checks are still blank. Give us a call. Anyway, unfortunately, things rarely go to plan when it comes to trying to remain balanced and provide, fair and authentic news. Rivals the authenticity of the salt on the sunburnt dirt that surrounds us here in the Western Queensland Channel Country. It's hard in the Outback journalism game. We always wanted to finish strong with the final two episodes by interviewing a frontbencher from both of the major parties. Last week we had Chris Bowen MP, Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Renewable Energy. And this week we had hoped to get the Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg on. Unfortunately, that fell through because Josh is currently in the fight of his life to save his job from an independent challenger in the shape of Professor Monique Ryan down there in Kooyong.
Yes, we then reached out to a range of other Liberals, but it seems the memo has gotten around that the Morrison government, to avoid any unnecessary media attention, kind of left us on scene. We couldn't even get a moderate backbencher like your Jason Polinsky's or even your Dave Sharmas. But, with the greatest respect, we might as well take off one of your shoes, Clancy, and interview that, because I'd say our many millions of listeners would probably get more out of it.
Yes, we don't feel like the fact that we weren't able to finish with Frydenberg makes us lefties, though, because earlier in the campaign we interviewed Nats and Libs. So go back and listen to that if you want. Shout out to Senator James Hume for joining us a few weeks back. You were the only Liberal to put your hand up. Luckily for us, though, today, for the last episode before the election, we have managed to wrangle an interview with an expert on both policy and politicisation, in the sense that she works on policy and is the victim of politicisation from those she is trying to work with. Anyway, we'll get into all that. I think this introduction has gone on far enough.
Yes, Clancy, as per usual, you're dribbling again. Listeners, let me introduce today's guest, friend of the show, Grace Tame. How are you?
Oh, look, I am all the better for being on the Betoota podcast with you two legends.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Oh, no worries. And look, I think I can do a good Josh Frydenberg impression. Just give me billions of dollars and I will throw them away.
Okay, well, off to a good start here. Where are you dialing in from today, Grace?
Hobart.
Hobart, home of the brave. How are your Strava splits looking nowadays?
My Strava splits are non-existent on account of on the 1st of February I was riding my bike, which I was doing in the interim from recovering from some bone injuries. And then, of course, I came off my bike and I broke my collarbone. So I haven't been really able to do very much at all. But, things could be worse. I didn't suffer any kind of brain injuries that I know of.
Well, I thought it was more or less to do with the fact that the sun goes down on the 8th of May in Hobart and comes up again on the 29th of August. This is what we're led to believe here in Western Queensland.
Yeah, look, whatever.
Bit of Hobart sledging to get us going. Now, Grace, has the 2022 federal election campaign has it been as fun for you as it has been for the rest of us?
Fun, yeah. Oh, gosh. I'm at once surprised and not surprised the depths to which this particular lot are prepared to sink. It never ceases to amaze me. And it's got nothing to do with party politics. I hope that Australia's realising that now. It's everything to do with human decency, basic human decency, really. It's interesting. There are a lot of parallels between this government and the Trump government. Mm-hmm. I was living in the US and was there for at least the first half of Trump's term. And you guys would be familiar with, or I assume you would be familiar with wrecking crew politics or that theory of leadership?
Yeah, we are. Do you want to explain it for the listeners?
Oh, well, it's really just abandonment of the people to the extent that there's an increasing privatisation of services. I mean, to cut a long story short, what the ultimate upshot of that is a complete deterioration of the middle class. And really what happens is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer to a really, really awful extent.
Well, yeah, it sounds a lot like what's happening here in Betoota with Mayor Keith Carton. I think he's a bit of a wrecking ball.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're describing there, Grace, it's happening in councils and governments right around Australia. The idea of painting yourselves in government and government, whether it's you or your opposition, painting yourselves as useless in the eyes of the voter so that they tend to lose faith in the system itself.
It's deliberate abandonment and neglect. It's very calculated and it's quite insidious as well. So this persecution of minorities, and the deliberate sacrificing, I suppose, of Warringah through the scapegoating of Catherine Deves is a political tactic that has a sort of broader design to it. And that is to appeal to the morals of people who have an ideology that reflects Scott Morrison's own. And it's really quite sad. And I think perhaps what Scott has forgotten, in the fog of his Canberra hive mind, perhaps, is that throughout his tenure, he has thrown a very high number of minorities under the bus, and that it isn't just a game to people and the public, it is our real lives. And, he might be semi-detached from, if not completely detached from it all up there, but out here we don't forget. And it's starting to add up now. And, who's going to be the Prime Minister for all these minorities? Because in reality, the trans community are Australians, and the trans youth, they are our future. Children are our future. Who are the voices of those people? Who are the leaders of those people? If not, our Prime Minister and, women and the disabled community who he sort of outed himself as sort of above, and that was what that comment was about. And I don't think perhaps that take wasn't explored, because people were like, oh, he didn't mean it. And it's like, well, of course it wasn't that it was planned. Somebody from the audience asked that question. But in that moment, what was revealed was that comment came from a person who sees people who are different to him in some way as being, lesser than or and it's become quite obvious now. There are lots of different people he's been prepared to sacrifice. Unfortunately, there are people in society who believe they are entitled to discard others who either challenge their power, who challenge their ideology.
Just an inconvenience to them.
Or people who were never going to vote for him anyway.
Yeah, or who persecute minorities, to bully even allies, to backstab friends. Like, one of those people is the Prime Minister.
It's interesting you say that they're adding up, because I've had to think about this just while you're talking now, and it's kind of, it was one thing to scapegoat the Muslim community heading into an election, but now we're learning that he also scapegoats the Christian Arabs into being Muslims, like he did there with Michael Toke down there for the pre-selection. And I guess what you're saying is that's fine. He can get away with that because the Maronite Lebanese don't represent that much of the voting population. But they know what he's done to them, and the Lebanese Muslims know what he's done to them. Now, the trans community knows how he feels about them, and I guess the disability community also know that he feels blessed to not be one of them. Do you think he's trodden on enough people to kind of feel that at the polls?
Yeah, I think you can't put it down to now a bias, and this is what I sort of was trying to point out very early on. It's not about me. I don't really like politics in general, oddly enough. I'm here to be an advocate of the survivor community. I can't speak for all survivors. There are many survivors who won't see themselves in me, that are very different to me. It's a very diverse community. We're just human beings, like any cohort, you're going to get differences of opinion within that community because, again, just a human. And the stats are 1 in 5. It's 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls that is abused before they're 18, and my trajectory is pretty rare. It's a gift to be heard, and it's not one that I take lightly. And I know that I make mistakes, and I'm just learning. I didn't go to uni. I don't know all the correct terminology. And sometimes, like I say things that, again, I don't intend to get wrong, but invariably I will stumble, and that's okay. I'm human, and I'm prepared to keep an open mind and listen and be, corrected along the way. And you sort of take people along the journey, but it's not about party politics at the end of the day. There are great representatives of the Liberal Party. The New South Wales Treasurer came out and said there's no place for this bigotry in the modern Liberal Party. And he's right. There's no place for this bigotry in the world. There's this misinformation too about trans children being mutilated. It's just like, you can't get the operation until you turn 18.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the wrecking ball politics. We've come out of the gate hot on this interview. I really enjoy having you on, Grace. Do you think Scott thinks that far ahead? Do you think when he intervened on the New South Wales pre-selections to get a candidate in Warringah, once the safest seat in the entire country, once held by Tony Abbott, he put someone in there who basically looks like she's trying to get a job on Sky News and just gives a weekly comment about, trans people and talking about things that obviously no one in her electorate's coming up to talk to her about. Do you think he's thinking that far ahead, or do you think he is just rolling with a crisis that he has created?
Well, the thing is, I don't know what he thinks. I don't really want to. What I can say is this. This is just my 2 cents, and one of my principles is I'm not here to try and force my 2 cents on anyone. I believe in, encouraging people to always be interrogating their conditioning and present ideas and my thoughts, and again, I'm not always right about things. But my take on it is that people who are, and I'm going to go right out and say it, people who are egocentric like him, or at least that's my
experience with him.
Well, I actually, thankfully, haven't spent that much one-on-one time with him. And I don't desire to, because the way that he responded to me, because I called him out and, called a spade, was to intimidate me with, his resources, which are far greater and more powerful than mine. That's how you want to use your resources as Prime Minister to carry out your petty, vindictive vendettas?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I hope you feel good about that while the country is in the middle of a pandemic and there are people dying, in floods, and there are still people who don't have their homes after the bushfires. Good job, Scott. Anyway, back to what I was saying.
But that's what you were saying is he doesn't give a consideration of what people are going through.
He doesn't know. He's so trapped in his ideology, which is somewhat, I would say, distorted in that, he's not unintelligent. He's quite intelligent too. Like, I'll give him that. He's the Prime Minister. No one can be the Prime Minister of a country. No one can be the leader of a country without having intelligence and skills and mastery, at least at manipulation.
Grace, this is a remarkably different interview we're having compared to the last time, and I'm going to explain why to the listeners. The last time we had you on, we rocked the boat just slightly when you were able to reveal, in the flow of conversation, some charming words that Scott Morrison whispered in your ear after your powerful 2021 Australian of the Year speech. That was a one-off. I don't think you wanted to rock the boat. We certainly didn't think after you said that it was going to end up on newspapers all around the country, but it was. But outside of that, you've actually been pretty tight. You've been a tight ship in terms of sharing your political opinions in that role. You took it quite seriously. All you did to earn the title as a lefty sleeper cell was look at him funny. And that was basically all you gave. And a few comments here and there that slightly criticised his character. But outside of that, you've remained an apolitical kind of advocate for survivors, which is, what you were when you first kind of became a household name as Australian of the Year. Can you tell us what it was like to keep your mouth shut? Because you did do that. I mean, I know it wasn't a responsibility, but you took that role quite seriously in that it wasn't about taking a baseball bat to Scott Morrison as the Australian of the Year. It was about, advocacy. What was it like to kind of have to bottle a few things up?
I don't know that I felt as though I really kept my mouth shut or anything. I didn't feel like I was... I wasn't walking around with, like a ball and chain around my ankle or anything like that. But I certainly opened my eyes up to a lot of things, and certainly getting to meet Brittany Higgins as I did in September and hear her experience firsthand, straight from the horse's mouth, which is what's really important to me because, even the most independent outlets, who have the best intentions, and it's not all media, of course, and there are some great outlets. Betoota Advocate, clean as a whistle. There's the Saturday paper and, like The Shot, which I've started writing for. But a lot of mainstream media, and I mean, you just look at the landscape, it speaks for itself when you hear the numbers. If you got Murdoch, who owns 59% of the metropolitan and national print media, and then you got Nine, which is the next biggest in line, and that's 23%. You got a total of 82% there alone, which is, pretty right-leaning. Here's what you got Costello, who sits on the board. Is he chair?
Chairman.
Or is he? Yeah, he's chairman of the board.
He's chairman of the board.
Yeah, Costello was former Liberal treasurer under Howard.
Yep.
Yeah. There's definitely no bias there. Oh. No.
But what we're saying is it didn't matter what you did. You were going to be painted as some sort of anti-ScoMo. Yeah.
What's interesting, how about this? If we just, again, this is what it's really about. It's about sitting back and critically thinking about a lot of these things. Because I spent, and I know this for a fact, because I went around the country and I spoke at events. Now, granted, some of them were private, so there couldn't be any media there to report on what I said for a reason, because I was talking about my story, which is very traumatic, and I talk about some of my experiences self-harming, not for shock value, but for the purpose of truth, because people need to understand what not only happened as a result, but what happened during. Because who still buys into this narrative of, it was a relationship, it was a consensual relationship between a 15-year-old and a 58-year-old man who I would go to during the abuse and I would have, cuts up my legs and arms, and he would still do things to me, knowing that that was a result of what he was doing to me. It's complete nonsense. Yeah. Sometimes media wasn't there, but I did plenty of television interviews where I talked in depth about the stages of grooming. In fact, at the National Press Club on the 3rd of March last year, I addressed an entire room of press gallery journalists, and the MC very politely at the beginning, she said, "Please do not ask Grace about the situation in Parliament," because it was then very recently that Brittany Higgins had made her allegations of the rape in Parliament. And this wasn't because I'm not capable of answering any question. It's mainly because what happens when you talk about these very activating subjects, when a human being or an animal is put into their amygdala, where trauma resides, they are reduced to an animal. It's fight, flight, freeze or fawn. That's where you go. You can be a rocket scientist and it won't matter. Logic becomes very hard, if not impossible, to access. So all these gotcha questions that journalists throw at you, it's really actually quite cruel. It's not that I'm, again, incapable, but, again, it doesn't matter who you are, you just reduced to those trauma responses. And then I even in my speech explained this to journalists that, ditch all your trying to get ratings or whatever. Like, I remember when I first got my voice back in 2019, I had an earpiece in and I was by myself in a room and I was on, I think it was Studio 10, and Kerry-Anne Kennelly, I couldn't even see anything. And Kerry-Anne Kennelly, after playing a clip that had the pedophile's voice in my ear in an interview with Bettina Arndt, which really activated me because I don't really like to hear his voice, go figure. She goes, take us back to your darkest moment. And it was like...
Fucking Christ.
Yeah, it wasn't really pleasant. I was actually in the midst of a bout of anorexia at the time. I was really underweight and not very well. Like, I held my own, but it was live on national television. It's like a box of chocolates in that moment. You could get anything. And it's like, yeah, okay, I'm tough, but you could do that to someone and they could break down and cry. You could do that to a war veteran and they would cry. Like, I haven't been to war, and I'm not comparing myself to someone who's been through that. But, like, I've also been through domestic violence too.
These are natural responses. Yeah.
It's not nice, don't do it.
Yeah.
So I explained in a very conciliatory way too to this room full of journalists, please don't do it. And also, the experience of abuse itself is underpinned by an erosion of boundaries, especially as a child and as someone who had no concept of boundaries from coming from a broken home and suppressing my own needs in order to fawn to one of my abusers before this abuser who I was fawning to as well. I didn't have much of a concept of boundaries and I was just asking for some basic respect. And this MC had too. And what did every journalist, I shit you not, every journalist do? As soon as I was finished, every single one asked me about politics and they had every opportunity to, raise this issue of grooming on the national stage. And they all just wanted in their little insular group to ask about politics, to get their gotcha moment, and it was disrespectful.
Yeah.
It recreated that dynamic wherein they held all the power and I was beneath them. And they weren't aware of it.
Yep.
And I was very respectful to them in that I answered their questions, but they couldn't see the irony right in front of their eyes.
Do you reckon it's always been like that, or do you think this is a result of a kind of news cycle that's treading water and they don't know where the industry's headed, or they're going for TikTok moments? That seems to be a feature of the current federal election campaign. Or do you think that's just them? There's the egos and there's a microphone in their hand and they're pointing it at you.
No, look, I don't know. I mean, it's not for me to make sort of broad stroke assessments of an industry, which is, in part, you can make assessments of the industry itself. You can make assessments of journalists themselves. There's lots of ways to sort of unpack it. But I think that the state of Australian journalism is pretty bad, I would say. Mm-hmm. The sensationalist journalistic model, it's really awful because, once upon a time, journalism was something different. It was just what was supposed to be an objective thing where you transmitted information from one source to another, and it was reporting on both good and tragic events. And now it could be said that the media contributes to them in some ways, and there is, like in the case of the Kitching saga, I mean, that was a confected saga. Mm-hmm. And one that was driven in many ways by the media.
Did you feel like there was any pressure to really conform to what the public perceived to be the right way for an Australian of the Year to act? Because, I think a lot of people have this perceived kind of notion that the Australian of the Year should do things like when Robert D. Costello opened the Arana Mall in Dubbo. That's what a lot of people think the Australian of the Year is there to do, is to simply perform a civic duty on behalf of the Australian people. Was there any pressure you felt to conform to, this cookie cutter way that people like to think?
No, I mean, many things can be true at once. I'll always be grateful for the opportunities. And again, having a platform is a gift. And in many ways, I owe a lot to the Australian of the Year Awards platform. And then at the same time, I could say that, I don't think a lot of people realise what it also has cost me and my family. Because, again, I didn't ask to be named Australian of the Year or nominated for Australian of the Year. It was something I had really no concept of, or very little concept of, prior to it all happening. And it happened in such an accelerated way. And that's sort of a very real reason why trauma is processed over a long period of time. And what happened in, especially in that really concentrated 12 months, and it's still happening now, is that, a lifetime of trauma was amplified. It was also then scrutinised, just relentlessly.
Yeah.
So what I was saying before is that there was this fantastic opportunity for all of this information that I was giving about pedophilia, about, sexual abuse of children, and particularly about this issue of grooming, which I was really trying to bring to the fore, about how successful predators are at, manufacturing this even love and fawning that their victims sort of become possessed into feeling, or not even feeling, but possessed into believing that they feel for their abusers. And I was trying to sort of really highlight this. And in a lot of ways, there was some coverage of that. But the media really focused on, because it was, and who knows to what extent the government is deferential to the media or vice versa. And that's, I don't know. But, it became the mainstream media, especially the Murdoch press, spent, a disproportionate amount of time reporting on this supposed obsession that I have with the Prime Minister, whereas in reality, I would say that 1% of the talking that I did, or the commentary that I've done, has been about him. I have travelled Australia and I have delivered, 45-minute keynotes followed by half an hour Q&As about
everything but him.
Yeah.
I don't really talk about him.
Jesus.
I mean, as far as tweeters go, I'm not a serial tweeter who tweets 5 times a day. I tweet very sporadically, and sometimes I do memes about hilltop hoods.
That was good stuff. I have to interject here and say, when you posted that photo of Barnaby's blood nose, for my people in the front, in the nosebleed section, that was really good stuff, Grace.
I felt bad about that, though. I was like, oh no, is that mean? And then I was like, but it's Barnaby Joyce.
Yeah. He can take a knock. He certainly has on the Betoota Advocate.
Yeah. Well, look, if there's anyone who can laugh at themselves, it's Barnaby, because if he doesn't have that, then what does he have?
You are quite a, some would say, a dry comic in many aspects. And that's what you use Twitter for. You're not up there berating the Prime Minister.
There is one thing I would like to know, is that what was your advice to Dylan as he handed on the baton? Because
Dylan doesn't need my advice.
He is a person who's spent a lot of his young life in the public eye, where when you became the Australian of the Year, it was the first a lot of people had heard of you. So what was that like?
Yeah, it's very bizarre. The opinions that really mean the most to me are the ones of the people that mean the most to me, so like Max and my little brother who's 12, and my mum and my cousins, and like my loved ones. Those are the ones. It's about staying grounded, feet on the ground and head out of the clouds, and not letting those sorts of things get swept up, and remembering your own humanity, and that we're all just people. I'm just an everyday Australian, and I always will be just an everyday Australian. And I'm no different to the person that I was before I was named Australian of the Year. I am the same, goofy, flawed individual.
Coming off bikes in Hobart.
And I'm no more entitled to anything than anybody else. And that's the problem is, if we want to go back to, Scott Morrison, is that his entitlement, words like, well, I'm the Prime Minister, you know, and like she should smile at me because I'm the Prime Minister. Like,
Yeah.
well, and I'm not saying smile at me because I'm the Australian of the Year.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Imagine Lee Kernaghan when he was Australian of the Year demanding people smile at him. Grace, I want to kind of talk about that, about your mortal sin of not smiling in front of a grown-up, or at least that's how he felt, and just everything around that. The pearl clutching that has happened. Obviously, a lot of it is media-led.
Yeah, a lot of it's artificial pearl clutching.
Pearl clutching. The same happened, you know, with every little fucking punch they could land on any advocates. The same thing happened with Goodsey, and I'm not comparing the two things, but any slight flaw or anything that they could run with, the media, they would. Do you actually think that translates to the punters? Do you actually think anyone cares about a bong? I certainly don't. I mean, Jesus, I couldn't believe the outrage. Do you think people care as much as we're led to believe? The outrage surrounding, you know, the side eye, the photo of the bong from fucking 10 years ago, whenever it was. I mean, you get to meet people. You're touring the country. You're probably meeting more people than the Prime Minister will in his incredibly well-controlled campaign. That doesn't translate through.
I haven't met a single person who's had the courage to say anything negative to my face.
Yeah.
Every negative comment that I have received has been online.
Yeah.
I think says something.
Yep.
But again, I think it's not really about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I've had sort of my whole life, although I'm definitely a stranger to fame in terms of being the object of it.
Yep.
I'm certainly not a stranger to the object of people's projections. And this kind of happened last year as well on a much bigger scale. Like I would wake up some mornings and I'd find my face on the cover of some article that had been written about fourth wave feminism, and I'd be like, I don't even know what second and third wave feminism is, but that's really lovely. I'm flattered. And then I'd wake up and there'd be an article like with my face all scrunched up, and it'd be something like angry something, and I'd be like, you know, and just none of it was written by people who even knew me, you know, and that's okay. And again, I focus on the opinions of my loved ones. Yep. But it was just like this constant slinging back and forth from people who just had no actual concept of who I was at all. And so this like whole smile thing was like to me, or like this frown thing was like a circuit breaker of this culture of just like keep upholding the status quo, which are just a crock of shit, really. And like I was standing next to Scott Morrison and I'm friends with Brittany and I'm like, I can't smile at you. Like, this is a crock of shit. All these, like, play nice human institutions that just harbour abusers, you know, and cover it up for the sake of what?
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like you're expected to fawn, in a sense, in those circumstances? I mean, you were behaving how you felt. We were seeing how you felt, and, you know, you just said then, you can't smile.
And I think a lot of people don't realise, or perhaps they do, but then, again, are triggered into this fawning because it is a visceral feeling, this fawning, you know, like, it's like the difference between, like, we're all happy to, like, I'm sure we've all done it, where we're in the shower and we're practicing what we're going to say to the people that really intimidate us, and we're practicing our arguments, you know, we're like getting the shampoo out, we're like, oh, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say that, and then we actually confront those people and they have this visceral effect on us. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden we start, you know, we just want to please them, and that is fawning. Yeah. It's guttural.
In your advocacy, Grace, you know, every conversation we have, I'm learning a lot, and I guess that's what advocacy is. Not familiar until this conversation with the, you know, the fourth response, which is fawn. I mean, I had heard freeze before, and obviously fight or flight's the one that gets trotted around, particularly for young men, where it's presented as something like, are you a man or a mouse? Are you going to, you know, fight or flight? You know, I'm learning a lot, and Errol is too. How do you have these conversations around policy when you're talking about these things to people who think they know everything, aren't as receptive as we are to your advocacy, or aren't as interested?
Well, you've got to talk to people. Again, you know, like, it's got to be the right time and place, and you've also got to understand that you can't force people to listen. You've got to go in to any conversation or situation not with this idea that you're going to change people's minds, that it's, it's a negotiation and that, it's about compromise. You've got to allow people to present their ideas too and make people feel comfortable and feel heard. One of the things that was fascinating to me was, I had the great honour, I think we talked about it last time, of, touring with John Cleese, even though John has completely lost me now with his aligning himself with J.K. Rowling and this anti-trans stuff. But I remember having to sort of go off and get supplies and stuff, and I got a few Ubers when we were in the Deep South. And I remember one of the drivers was a hardcore Trump supporter. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of sat there and I listened to him talking about his views and didn't argue with him or anything, just listened to him, just gave him an ear. And that's a huge part of my job, is as much as it is about talking to people and sharing experiences, it's about listening and, again, making space and sharing the platform and, allowing people to present their ideas. And
do you find it works using, these kind of measured tactics in talking to and working with people who you could be chalk and cheese with?
Yeah, I mean, you usually find common ground with any human beings, or most of the time, I think. Yeah. And if you go in, it's like any situation. If you go in with an attitude, with an open mind, you will get a good outcome most of the time. I mean, there's always going to be situations that don't work out. But it's like if you go up to a snake with a stick and poke it, you're probably going to get bitten, So, don't go into policy meetings with a stick, is the moral of that story.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about, kind of off the back of what we're just talking about here, obviously Anthony Albanese, you guys have developed a rapport. But it is interesting, you don't let him off scot-free. It hasn't stopped you from keeping the bastard honest. Do you find he is perhaps easier to talk to?
Yeah, well, he's more respectful, and he's a real person.
And what would you, Grace, say to the Australian people in these final days? I mean, I know that's not your job, but you're on a platform that a fair few people listen to. What would you kind of say? Yeah,
again, it's not about party politics.
No,
it really isn't. Like I said before, people accuse me of being a Labor hack all the time, which, whatever. It's about principles, and those principles are honesty, authenticity, integrity. But also sticking up for the underdog is such a huge part of Australian culture. Even if you just do isolate it to this particular example of this, fraudulent hate campaign, wherein the Prime Minister is prepared to sacrifice one of the most discriminated against minorities in, LGBT youth. They're the underdog.
Yeah.
And if he's prepared to sacrifice LGBT youth, trans youth, in order to maintain power, who else is he prepared to sacrifice?
Yep.
That is not the Australian way. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody.
Yeah.
You lead for us. You lead for everyone. Just ask yourself that. I can't tell you who to vote for. I can't tell you what to do. That's not my job. But just ask yourself, you don't have to sit. You don't have to have these people in your home if that's what you're worried about. If that's all, they're not forcing their values on you. That's the whole point. These people's freedoms do not compromise your freedoms. Yeah. Even though that's how he's trying to spin it. Yeah. They actually don't. Trans kids, not a lot of them actually want to play sport. Yep.
No.
That's misinformation too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just really think about it.
We'll take it back to the top. We'll finish on with that on the top. Just think about the different communities that have been trodden on, and now we're seeing in the desperate kind of rattle of this election, it's obviously it's kids.
Children are the future. That's who I'm a representative of. I'm here for survivors of abuse, and discrimination, and children are the future.
Well, you're doing an incredible job. You're a gem. Thank you for joining us today. Enjoy your sausage sizzle on Saturday, Grace Tame.
At the election.
That's assuming you haven't already voted on the pre-polls.
Or maybe down in Tassie they just have a candied apple or something. I don't know. I've only been there once. So, yeah.
Fairy floss. Yeah, thank you for joining us, Grace. It's always great to have you on, and we'll have to catch up when we inevitably go down to that museum of necrophilic art. Is that what it's called?
Oh my goodness. May as well be.
Yeah. Thank you. That's our final episode of Decode before the 2022 federal election, and it has been quite an insightful yarn, particularly, I'll say so for myself, and thank you, Grace, for, again, lending your time and labour to talking to us and our listeners.
No worries.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Grace.
Always a pleasure.